A handsome prince dangles helpless from an oak tree, his famous hair tangled in the branches, his mule galloping away beneath him. He's still alive, still breathing, and the general marching toward him carries 3 javelins. This is not an execution. This is revenge. And what makes this moment even more chilling, the man hanging in that tree is the king's own son. Welcome to Forgotten Scriptures, where we uncover the Bible's most violent, controversial, and overlooked stories. Today, we're diving into one of the most tragic tales in all of scriptural story of beauty turned to betrayal, ambition corrupted into civil war, and a father forced to choose between his throne and his son. If you're ready for a biblical story that reads like a Shakespearean tragedy, hit that subscribe button, because this is about to get dark. This is Forgotten Scriptures. To understand how we got to this horrifying moment in the forest, we need to go back to ancient Israel during the golden age of King David's reign. This is around 1000 BCE, and Jerusalem has become the political and spiritual capital of a united kingdom stretching from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. David, the former shepherd boy who killed Goliath, now sits on the most powerful throne in the region. But here's what they don't teach you in Sunday school. David's palace was a powder keg of dysfunction, polygamy, and barely concealed hatred. David had multiple wives and many children, and they all lived together in Jerusalem's royal compound. Imagine the tension. Different mothers vying for influence, different sons competing for their father's attention and the future throne. This wasn't a family. It was a political battlefield disguised as a household. The kingdom might have been united on the outside, but inside the palace walls, rivalries festered like open wounds. The geography matters here. Jerusalem sits on a ridge between the Mediterranean coast and the Dead Sea, surrounded by valleys that made it defensible but also isolated. To the east lies the Judean wilderness, a harsh, unforgiving landscape of caves and cliffs. To the north, the fertile hills of Ephraim, thick with oak forests. These locations will become the stage for a war between father and son. But before we get to war, we need to understand the event that set everything in motion. David had committed adultery with Bathsheba and arranged the murder of her husband. Uriah, the prophet Nathan, confronted David with a chilling prophecy. The sword will never depart from your house. God forgave David, but the consequences would play out in blood. His own family would turn against him. Violence would consume his children. This prophecy wasn't theoretical. It was a death sentence waiting to be executed. And the first domino to fall was rape. David's firstborn son, Amnon, became obsessed with his half-sister Tamar. He lured her into his room and raped her. Then, in a twist of cruelty, he threw her out like garbage. Tamar, devastated and dishonored, fled to her full brother's house. That brother's name? Now let's talk about Absalom himself. Scripture tells us that in all Israel there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. This wasn't just attractiveness. This was the kind of beauty that turned heads, that made people stop and stare. The text even describes his hair. When he cut the hair of his head at the end of every year, he used to cut it. When it was heavy on him, he cut it. He weighed the hair of his head, 200 shekels by the king's weight. 200 shekels is about 5 pounds of hair. Let me repeat that. 5 pounds. His hair was his pride, his identity, his symbol of royalty and strength. Remember that detail? It becomes horrifyingly ironic later. But Absalom was more than just beautiful. He was Tamar's full brother, both children of Mesahach, a foreign princess from Geshur. This gave Absalom royal blood from both sides. He had lineage, he had looks, he had charisma, and when his sister came to him, broken and weeping, he had raged. For 2 full years, Absalom said nothing. He didn't confront Amnon. He didn't appeal to David. He waited, planned, and when the time was right, he invited all the king's sons to a sheep shearing festival in the countryside. It was supposed to be a celebration. Absalom got Amnon drunk, and then, at his command, his servants struck Amnon down, murdered him in cold blood at the dinner table. Absalom fled immediately. He didn't wait to see his father's reaction. He ran north to Geshur, his mother's homeland, and lived in exile for 3 years. And here's where it gets complicated. David mourned Amnon, Yes, but Scripture tells us the spirit of the king longed to go out to Absalom. David missed his son, but he was also the king. How could he pardon a murderer without undermining his own authority? After 3 years, David's general Joab orchestrated a scheme to bring Absalom back. A wise woman from Tekoa came to David with a fabricated story that mirrored his own situation, and David, recognizing the trap, agreed to let Absalom return. But there was a condition. Absalom could come back to Jerusalem, but he was not permitted to see the king's face. Imagine that, living in the same city as your father, but being forbidden from his presence. For 2 more years, Absalom lived in Jerusalem as a ghost in his father's kingdom. No recognition, no reconciliation, no path to the throne. And bitterness grew. Resentment festered. Absalom wasn't just angry at his father anymore. It was hungry for power, hungry for justice, hungry for the throne he believed should be his. So he began to campaign. Every morning Absalom would stand at the city gate where people came to seek the king's judgment. When someone approached with a legal dispute, Absalom would intercept them. He'd listen to their grievances, shake his head sympathetically, and say, "Your claims are good and right, but there is no one designated by the king to hear you." Then he'd add the poison. "Oh, that I would judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice." Scripture says Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. He was charming, magnetic, and he made people feel seen. For 4 years, he built a network of loyalty that ran deeper than his father's authority. And when the moment was perfect, he asked David for permission to go to Hebron to fulfill a vow. David, unsuspecting, said yes. Hebron was David's first capital, the place where he was originally crowned king of Judah. Absalom chose it deliberately. He sent messengers throughout Israel with a coded signal. "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say Absalom is king at Hebron." And when the trumpet sounded, the conspiracy exploded into open rebellion. Tribes rallied, warriors joined. Even Ahithophel, David's most trusted counselor, betrayed him and sided with Absalom. When David received the news, he didn't hesitate. He fled Jerusalem. The king who had conquered giants and nations ran from his own son. He took his household, his loyal soldiers, and abandoned the city. As he crossed the Kidron Valley, weeping and barefoot, the people wept with him. This was a funeral procession for a kingdom that hadn't yet died. But David wasn't without a plan. He sent his friend Hushai back to Jerusalem to infiltrate Absalom's court and sabotage his strategy in Idwarkid. When Absalom took the city, Ahithophel advised him to strike immediately to pursue David while he was vulnerable and disorganized. It was brilliant tactical advice, but Hushai countered with a different plan. Gather all of Israel's armies first, build an overwhelming force, and then crush David completely. Absalom, drunk on his own success, chose Hushai's advice. It was a fatal mistake. It gave David time to cross the Jordan, time to regroup, time to prepare for war. And here's where Absalom made his most public act of defiance. On the roof of the palace, in full view of all Israel, Absalom went into his father's concubines, 10 women, publicly, violently. This wasn't just about sex. It was about power, about dominance, about declaring to everyone that David's reign was over. The prophet Nathan had told David that because of his sin with Bathsheba, his own wives would be violated publicly. The prophecy was being fulfilled in the most brutal way possible. Meanwhile, Ahithophel, seeing that his counsel had been rejected, went home and hanged himself. He knew what was coming. He knew Absalom had just lost the war. The armies met in the Forest of Ephraim, east of the Jordan. David's forces were organized and battle-hardened. Absalom's forces were numerous, but undisciplined. Before the battle began, David gave his commanders one direct order: deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. Even now, even in the middle of a civil war, David loved his son. The battle was a slaughter. 20,000 men died that day. But the forest killed more men than the sword. The terrain was treacherous, thick with undergrowth, gnarled with ancient oaks, impossible to navigate on horseback. And somewhere in that chaos, Absalom found himself face to face with David's soldiers. He tried to escape. He mounted his mule and rode hard beneath the canopy of a great oak tree, but his head or his hair Scripture is ambiguous. God in the thick branches. The mule kept running, and Absalom was left suspended between heaven and earth, dangling helpless in the air. Still alive, still conscious. Still the would-be king. One of David's men saw him and ran to Joab, the commander. "I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree." Joab's response was cold. "Why didn't you strike him down? I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a warrior's belt." The soldier refused. "Even if you placed 1,000 pieces of silver in my hands, I would not lay a hand on the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, protect the young man Absalom. For my sake." Joab had no such hesitation. Scripture records it with brutal clarity. He took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak tree. Let that image sink in. Absalom, tangled by the very hair that symbolized his pride, pierced through the heart by 3 spears while hanging defenseless. And it didn't end there. 10 of Joab's armor-bearers surrounded Absalom and struck him down, finishing what Joab started. They threw his body into a large pit in the forest and piled a great heap of stones over it. No royal burial. No mourning, just a heap of rocks in the wilderness. And all of Israel fled to their tents. When David received the news, he didn't celebrate. He didn't rejoice in his victory. He went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. His cry echoes through Scripture. "Oh, my son, Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." The man who had everything, who had beauty, intelligence, charisma, royal blood, popular support, died hanging from a tree, betrayed by his own pride. Absalom had raised monuments to himself during his life. 2 Samuel tells us he took and set up for himself a pillar in the king's valley, for he said, "I have no son to keep my name in remembrance." He called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. But his real monument was a pile of stones in a forgotten forest. The war ended. David's throne was secured, but the cost was catastrophic. Israel had been torn apart. Thousands were dead, and David had lost another son. The sword had not departed from his house. So what does this story mean? In the pattern of biblical narrative, Absalom's story is a tragedy of unchecked ambition and unresolved bitterness. He had legitimate grievances. His sister had been violated. His father had done nothing. But instead of seeking reconciliation, he sought revenge. Instead of waiting for justice, he pursued power, and it destroyed him. The method of his death is theologically significant. Hanging from a tree carried a specific meaning in ancient Israel. Deuteronomy declares, "Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree." Absalom died under a curse, and ironically, the hair that was his glory became his trap, the very thing he was most proud of. This story also reveals something profound about God's justice. David's sin with Bathsheba set a pattern of violence in motion that couldn't be stopped by human effort. Amnon raped Tamar. Absalom killed Amnon. Absalom died violently. Sin has consequences that ripple through generations. Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. And yet, even in judgment, there's a shadow of mercy. David's grief for Absalom mirrors God's grief over rebellious humanity. The father who would have died in his son's place points forward to a greater father who would actually do that, who would send his own son to hang on a tree and bear the curse for us. Now, what can we learn from Absalom's tragedy? First, bitterness is a slow poison. Absalom waited 2 years to kill Amnon. He nurtured his rage, let it grow, let it consume him. When we refuse to forgive, we don't hurt the people who wronged us. We destroy ourselves. Second, charm without character is dangerous. Absalom was beautiful, charismatic, and persuasive. But beauty doesn't equal wisdom. Popularity doesn't equal righteousness. The world is full of attractive people, leading others toward destruction. Third, rebellion always costs more than we think. Absalom thought he was fighting for justice. He ended up causing a civil war that killed 20,000 people and tore a nation apart. When we rebel against God-given authority, whether that's parents, leaders, or God himself, the collateral damage is always worse than we imagine. Fourth, pride literally goes before a fall. Absalom's hair was his pride. It got him killed. What are you most proud of? What do you display to the world as your identity? Because the things we exalt about ourselves often become the very things that trap us. Fifth, even justified anger doesn't justify sin. Absalom had every right to be angry about Tamar's rape, but anger didn't give him the right to murder Amnon or overthrow his father. Righteous anger must be channeled righteously. Otherwise, it just becomes another sin. And finally, God's discipline is real, but so is his love. David faced the consequences of his sin, but God didn't abandon him. The throne was preserved. The lineage continued. Through David's line would eventually come Jesus, the true king who would hang on a tree, not for his own sins, but for ours. Absalom's story was forgotten because it's uncomfortable. It doesn't fit neatly into inspirational sermons or children's lessons. It's messy, tragic, violent. But it's real, and it reveals truths about human nature, about justice, about the cost of rebellion, and about a father's love that we desperately need to understand. The handsome prince who had everything lost it all because he couldn't let go of his bitterness and his pride. Next time on Forgotten Scriptures, we're diving into another story that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about the Old Testament. A queen thrown from a window, dogs licking up her blood in the streets, and a prophetic curse fulfilled in the most gruesome way imaginable. You won't want to miss Jezebel's fall. If this story impacted you, drop a comment and tell me, what do you think David should have done differently? Could this tragedy have been prevented? And hit that subscribe button so you don't miss another episode. This is Forgotten Scriptures, where the Bible's darkest stories come to light.